I should have left hours ago, but I'm still here, watching my reflection ghost across the diner window. The coffee in my cup went cold before I even touched it. Outside, snow falls in thick, lazy flakes, the kind that sticks to everything and makes the world feel muffled and distant. My coat hangs heavy on my shoulders, still damp from the walk-in. Small crystals of ice cling to the wool, melting slowly in the warmth. The waitress behind the counter knows me. She's worked here longer than I've been coming, which is saying something. Jules, she calls me, the way she always has, like we're old friends instead of strangers who share the same small town and the same late-night insomnia. Tonight, though, I don't answer when she says it. I can't. My throat feels tight, and my hands won't stop trembling against the ceramic mug. I'm 38 years old, and I'm waiting for a ghost. The bell above the door stays silent. The parking lot beyond the glass remains empty except for my car, a lonely island under the yellow streetlight. I check my phone. 12:47. Part of me hopes he won't come. Part of me has been hoping that for weeks, ever since I got his message. But I'm still here, aren't I? Still waiting like I always have, like I always will. Then the headlights cut through the darkness. A pickup truck, older than it should be, slides into the lot with the careful precision of someone who knows winter driving. The engine idles for a moment before going quiet. Through the windshield, I can make out a silhouette, broader than I remember, but unmistakable in the way it sits, the way it hesitates before opening the door. My chest tightens. 20 years collapse into nothing. He steps out, and I see him clearly for the first time since we were kids. Damien Holt. His hair is grayer now, shorter, and there are lines around his eyes that weren't there before. He's heavier, softer at the edges, but he moves the same way he always did. Confident, deliberate, like he knows exactly where he belongs in the world. I used to think I knew that feeling. Our eyes meet through the window, and something inside me breaks apart and reassembles itself all at once. The air in the diner shifts, becomes thinner, harder to breathe. He doesn't smile. Neither do I. We just look at each other across 20 years of silence, and I remember everything I've spent 2 decades trying to forget. The memory comes without warning, sharp and sudden as glass. A summer afternoon, the kind that stretches on forever when you're 17. We're lying in the grass behind his house, laughing about something stupid, something I can't even remember now. The sun is hot on our faces, and the world feels infinite. Damien rolls over, props himself up on his elbow, and punches my shoulder the way he always does. "You're like a brother to me," he says, grinning. I smile back because that's what I'm supposed to do. But something flickers behind my eyes, something I can't name and don't want to. I turn away, pretending to watch the clouds, and the moment passes like all the others. Buried, forgotten, safe. But nothing stays buried forever. The bell above the door chimes, and Damien steps inside, bringing the cold with him. Snow clings to his jacket, melts in his hair. He doesn't look around, doesn't acknowledge the waitress or the empty booths. He walks straight to my table and sits down across from me, the vinyl cushion sighing under his weight. We don't speak. What is there to say? How do you start a conversation that should have happened 20 years ago? How do you bridge a gap that wide, that deep? The waitress approaches with a coffee pot, but Damien waves her away without looking up. His hands rest flat on the table, fingers spread wide. I notice his wedding ring is gone. There's still a pale band of skin where it used to be. Finally, he speaks, his voice quieter than I remember, rougher around the edges. I lied. The words hang between us like smoke, impossible to take back. I know what he means. I've always known. But hearing him say it out loud makes my hands shake harder against the mug, makes the air in the diner feel even thinner. I don't respond. I can't. Because if I open my mouth, if I let even one word escape, everything I've built, everything I've carefully constructed over the past 20 years will come tumbling down. And maybe, after all this time, I'm finally ready to let it fall. 3 weeks before that night in the diner, I was standing in front of 28 seventh graders, trying to explain why metaphors matter. The classroom smelled like pencil shavings and teenage anxiety. Outside the windows, October in rural Ohio painted itself in shades of rust and gold, The kind of beauty that makes you ache for something you can't name. I've been teaching English at Millbrook Middle School for 14 years now. The other teachers call me Mr. Price, but they also call me kind. Distant, but kind. They invite me to their barbecues and birthday parties, and I always have a reason why I can't make it. They've stopped asking about my family. I keep my life bordered, neat as the lesson plans I write in careful cursive every Sunday night. My house sits on Maple Street, 3 blocks from the school, close enough that I walk to work when the weather allows. It's the same house I grew up in, the one my mother left me when she died 5 years ago. Victorian bones with modern updates she never wanted to make. I kept her garden, though I tend it with something closer to devotion than she ever did. Roses in June, tomatoes in August, chrysanthemums when the first frost threatens. My mornings start at 5:30. Coffee brewed in the same blue mug I've used for a decade. The crossword puzzle from yesterday's paper, always in pen, never pencil. I finish it most days, but not all. On the days I don't, I fold the paper carefully and put it in the recycling bin with the blank squares unfilled. Some things aren't meant to be completed, but that's the life I built after. Before, there was something else entirely. Before, there was Damien. We met when I was 12 and he was 13, the summer his family moved to the house 2 streets over. I was reading under the oak tree in my backyard when a football came sailing over the fence and landed in my mother's flower bed. A few seconds later, a boy appeared at the gate, grinning like he'd planned the whole thing. "Sorry about that," he said, but he didn't look sorry. He looked curious. From that day forward, we were inseparable in the way only children can be. Summers stretched endless between us. We rode our bikes to the quarry outside town and jumped from rocks that seemed impossibly high. We snuck into the drive-in theater, hiding in the bed of his older brother's pickup truck. We stayed up until dawn playing video games and talking about everything except the things that mattered most. Damien was everything I wasn't. Bold where I was careful. Physical where I was cerebral. He threw himself into life like it was a river he couldn't wait to swim. I watched from the shore, always watching, always wanting to follow but never quite brave enough to jump. High school only magnified the differences between us. Damien played varsity football and dated cheerleaders whose names I tried not to remember. I edited the school newspaper and spent lunch periods in the library, reading books that had nothing to do with my classes. But somehow, impossibly, we remained close. He'd drive me home after his practices, singing badly to whatever song was on the radio. I'd help him with his English essays, the ones that were always late, always handwritten on loose-leaf paper torn from a spiral notebook. The girls he dated never lasted long. There was always something missing, he'd tell me afterward, sitting on the tailgate of his truck in some empty parking lot. Some spark that just wasn't there. I'd nod and make appropriate sounds of sympathy, but inside, something dark and hungry would unfurl in my chest. Something I couldn't name and didn't want to examine too closely. I never dated anyone. Not girls, not boys, not anyone. When people asked, I'd say I was focused on school, on college applications, on the future I was building with careful precision. The truth was simpler and more complicated than that. The truth was that my heart had already made its choice, even if my mind refused to acknowledge it. The wedding photo still hangs in my hallway, tucked between my college diploma and a painting of Lighthouse my mother bought at a craft fair. Damien in a black tuxedo, his arm around a woman named Naomi with honey-colored hair and a smile that looked like it belonged in magazines. I'm standing beside them, the best man, wearing a smile that felt like a mask I couldn't remove. I still have the speech I gave that night, folded carefully in the back of a drawer I rarely open. 3 pages of careful prose about friendship and love and the future stretching bright before them. I remember practicing it in the mirror, trying to make my voice steady, trying to make the words sound like they came from someone who meant them instead of someone who was slowly breaking apart. The letter arrived on a Tuesday in early October, mixed in with bills and grocery store circulars. My name handwritten on cream-colored paper, no return address. Inside, the details of our 20-year high school reunion, scheduled for the weekend before Halloween. A list of classmates who'd already RSVP'd, hotel recommendations for out-of-town guests, a nostalgic photograph of our graduating class arranged on the football field bleachers. At the bottom, in handwriting I would have recognized anywhere, a simple note. You should come. -D. I held that letter for a long time, standing in my kitchen as the afternoon light shifted across the linoleum floor. 20 years since I'd seen that handwriting. 20 years since I'd heard his voice or seen his face except in dreams. I tried not to remember. I told myself I wouldn't go. I had lesson plans to write, papers to grade, a garden that needed preparing for winter. I had a life here, quiet and safe and carefully constructed. What good could come from opening doors I'd spent decades learning to keep closed? But that night, I dreamed of summer afternoons and late-night drives and the sound of his laugh echoing across 20 years of silence. I woke up with his name on my lips and the taste of something like regret in my mouth. The invitation sat on my kitchen counter for 3 days before I finally wrote back. A simple response card, a single checkmark next to the word attending, no message of my own. I mailed it before I could change my mind, walking to the post office in the early morning darkness, my breath visible in the October air. The letter disappeared into the blue mailbox with a soft thud, and I stood there for a long moment afterward, wondering what I'd just set in motion, what I'd just allowed myself to hope for again. The weeks between mailing that response card and the actual reunion stretched like a held breath. I found myself distracted in ways I hadn't been in years. I'd lose track of what I was saying mid-sentence while teaching, staring out the classroom windows at nothing. My students noticed. Mrs. Henderson from the room next door asked if I was feeling all right. I told her I was fine, but we both knew I was lying. 3 times, I picked up the phone to call the reunion committee and cancel. 3 times, I set it back down without dialing. The 4th time, I unplugged it from the wall entirely and left it that way for 2 days. But the truth was already working its way to the surface, the way truth always does eventually. The truth was that I'd been waiting for this invitation for 20 years, even when I told myself I never wanted to see him again. Even after what almost happened the night after his wedding. I've never spoken about that night to anyone. Not to therapists, not to friends, not even to myself in the privacy of my own thoughts. But alone in my house, with the reunion growing closer and sleep becoming more elusive, the memory surfaced like something dredged up from deep water. It was June 2004. The wedding had been perfect in the way weddings are supposed to be perfect. Naomi looked radiant. Damien looked happy. I delivered my speech without my voice breaking, danced with elderly aunts and college friends, and smiled until my face ached. I was 28 years old and convinced I was handling everything exactly as I should. The reception ended late. Most of the guests had gone home or back to their hotel rooms. I was staying at the Comfort Inn on Route 9, the same place as most of the wedding party. Damien was supposed to leave for his honeymoon the next morning, but something about airport delays and rescheduled flights meant they weren't flying out until Sunday. I was walking to my car in the parking lot when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see another wedding guest heading to their room, and instead found Damien jogging toward me. His bow tie was undone, hanging loose around his neck. His jacket was slung over his shoulder. "Where are you going?" he asked, slightly out of breath. "Home," I told him. "It's late." "Stay," he said. "Have one more drink with me." I almost said yes. God help me, I almost said yes. But something in his voice, something in the way he was looking at me, made alarm bells ring in my head. So I shook my head and reached for my car door handle. That's when he grabbed my shirt. Not hard, not violently. Just his fist closing around the fabric near my collar, pulling me close enough that I could smell the champagne on his breath and see the way his pupils had dilated in the parking lot lights. For a moment, just a moment, we stood there like that, close enough to kiss, close enough for me to see something in his eyes that I'd been pretending not to notice for years. Then, as suddenly as it had happened, he let go and stepped back. "You're like a brother to me," he said. The same words he'd said a dozen times before. But this time they sounded different. This time they sounded like an apology. I smiled because I didn't know what else to do. Because smiling was safer than acknowledging what had just passed between us. Because if I opened my mouth, I might have said something that would have changed both our lives forever. I drove home that night with my hands shaking on the steering wheel. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat breakfast. At 7 in the morning, I threw 2 suitcases in my car and drove to Columbus, where my college roommate lived. I told him I needed to get out of town for a while. He didn't ask questions. I stayed there for 3 weeks. When I finally came back, Damien and Naomi were settled into their new house across town. I heard through mutual friends that he'd asked about me, wondered where I'd gone. I never called him back. I never explained. That was 20 years ago, and I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, remembering the way his hand felt against my chest. The morning of the reunion, I stood in front of my closet for 20 minutes trying to decide what to wear. Nothing seemed right. Everything seemed loaded with meaning I didn't want to examine. Finally, I chose a simple gray sweater and dark jeans, the same outfit I might wear to grade papers on a Saturday. Safe. Unremarkable. The drive to the hotel took 45 minutes through countryside I'd known my entire life. Rolling hills that looked like sleeping animals. Farmhouses with lights glowing yellow in their windows. Cornfields harvested down to stubble. I'd driven these roads 1,000 times, but that day they felt foreign, like I was seeing them through someone else's eyes. I almost turned around near Millerville, where Route 22 curves past the old Miller farm. I slowed down, pulled onto the shoulder, sat there with the engine idling. A pickup truck passed me going the other direction, and for one heart-stopping moment, I thought it might be him. It wasn't, but the possibility was enough to make me pull back onto the road and keep driving. I almost turned around again at the Sunoco station just outside town, and again at the traffic light 2 blocks from the hotel. But each time, something stronger than fear kept my foot on the gas pedal. Some terrible, wonderful curiosity about what 20 years had done to both of us. The reunion was being held in the ballroom of the Hampton Inn, the same place where half our class had held their wedding receptions. I could hear the music through the glass doors before I even walked inside. Classic rock from our high school years, played just loud enough to cover the awkwardness of middle-aged people trying to pretend they were still 18. I paid my registration fee to a woman I vaguely remembered from student council and received a name tag with my senior picture on it. 18-year-old me stared back from the adhesive square, all sharp cheekbones and serious eyes. I looked like I was trying to solve a particularly difficult equation. The ballroom was exactly what I'd expected. Round tables covered in hotel linens. A slideshow of old photographs rotating on a screen at the front of the room. A cash bar staffed by college students who looked impossibly young. People clustered in groups that probably mirrored the lunch table arrangements from 2 decades ago, the invisible social hierarchies still intact. I moved through the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned long ago how to be present without being noticed. I shook hands and made small talk about careers and children and mortgage rates. I accepted condolences about my mother and offered congratulations about promotions and graduations. I was good at this kind of interaction. I'd had years to perfect the art of seeming engaged while remaining essentially invisible. Then I saw him. He was standing near the bar, wearing the same leather jacket he'd worn in high school, talking to Marcus Webb, who'd been our quarterback. 20 years had changed him in ways that were both obvious and subtle. His dark hair was shot through with silver now. There were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before. He was broader through the shoulders, softer around the middle. But his laugh was exactly the same, and the way he gestured with his hands when he talked, and the way he tilted his head when he was listening. Our eyes met across the room, and everything else fell away. The music, the conversations, the careful small talk I'd been making for the past hour. None of it mattered. There was only him, looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read, and me, standing frozen in the middle of a crowd of people who suddenly felt like strangers. He excused himself from his conversation and walked toward me, not hurrying, but not hesitating either. When he reached me, he didn't extend his hand for a shake or lean in for a hug. He just stood there, close enough that I could smell his cologne, the same brand he'd worn in high school. "Julian," he said, and my name in his voice was like coming home and leaving home at the same time. "Damien," I replied, because what else was there to say? We talked for a few minutes about safe things. Work and weather and how strange it was to see everyone again. But underneath the careful conversation, something else was happening. some silent negotiation I wasn't sure I understood. Later, after the dinner and the speeches and the presentation of awards to people who'd achieved various kinds of success, we found ourselves walking through the empty halls of our old high school. The janitor had left one entrance unlocked for the reunion committee, and somehow we'd ended up there, two middle-aged men wandering through corridors that had once contained the entire scope of our world. The building smelled exactly the same. Floor wax and teenage desperation and the lingering ghost of cafeteria food. Our footsteps echoed off the tile floors. The trophy cases were fuller than they'd been in our day, but the same faded photographs of homecoming queens and state championship teams stared out from behind the glass. Damien stopped in front of our old locker, number 247. The combination lock was long gone, replaced by a newer model, but the dents and scratches we'd inflicted were still there. "Do you remember that time we got caught skipping class?" he asked, running his fingers over the metal surface. The question seemed casual, but nothing between us was casual anymore. I knew exactly which time he meant. Junior year, third period American history. We'd climbed out the window of the first-floor bathroom and spent the afternoon at the quarry, talking about everything and nothing, lying on the warm rocks with our shirts off and the sun on our faces. "I remember everything," I told him, and the words came out quieter than I'd intended. He turned to look at me then, and in the fluorescent light of the empty hallway, 20 years collapsed into nothing. We were 17 and 18 again, standing at the edge of something we didn't have names for, something we didn't know how to want. The silence stretched between us, full of all the things we'd never said. We stood there in that empty hallway for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes everyone look slightly ill. But Damien didn't look ill. He looked like he was seeing me for the first time in 20 years, really seeing me, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that kind of scrutiny. Finally, he spoke. His voice was softer than it had been at the reunion, more careful. "I've thought about calling you," he said, 100 times over the years. I'd pick up the phone and dial 6 digits before hanging up. "Why didn't you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Because I was married," he said simply, "and because I was a coward." The honesty of it hit me like a physical blow. All these years, I'd told myself that he'd forgotten about that night, about the way his hand had felt against my chest, about the look in his eyes before he'd stepped away and called me his brother. But he'd remembered. He'd been carrying it too. We walked back to the parking lot in silence, our footsteps echoing off the empty corridors. Outside, the October air was sharp with the promise of winter. Most of the reunion crowd had already left. The parking lot was nearly empty except for our cars, parked coincidentally side by side. He stood beside his truck, keys in his hand, but making no move to unlock the door. "Maybe we could get coffee sometime," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Catch up properly." I should have said no. Should have gotten in my car and driven home and returned to the quiet, careful life I'd built for myself. Should have remembered all the reasons why some doors are better left closed. Instead, I heard myself saying yes. The first time we met was 3 days later, at a diner on the outskirts of town that neither of us had any particular attachment to. Neutral ground, I suppose, though I didn't think of it that way at the time. I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in a booth facing the door, watching for his truck through the windows. When he walked in, I felt that same jolt of recognition I'd experienced at the reunion, that sense of time folding in on itself. But this time, without the crowd and the music and the careful social choreography, he seemed more real somehow, more present. We talked about safe things at first. His divorce, which had been finalized 8 months earlier. My teaching job, which he seemed genuinely interested in hearing about. The changes in our hometown, which had grown smaller and more insular in the years since we'd graduated. But underneath the careful conversation, something else was happening. Some slow recognition of the people we'd become in each other's absence. He told me he'd been lost since the divorce, drifting in ways that surprised him. I told him about my mother's death, how quiet the house had become without her steady presence. We didn't talk about the past, not directly, but it hung between us like smoke. When the check came, We both reached for it at the same time. Our hands brushed over the leather folder, and I pulled mine back as if I'd been burned. "My treat," he said, but his voice had changed. Become softer, more uncertain. I let him pay. We started meeting regularly after that. Once a week at first, then twice, then whenever we could find excuses to get away from our respective responsibilities. Always somewhere public, always with the pretense of catching up, of renewing an old friendship. But we both knew it was something else. He took me to places we'd haunted as teenagers. The quarry where we'd spent summer afternoons. The back roads where he'd taught me to drive stick shift in his father's pickup. The overlook where we'd gone to think and talk and stare out at the valley spread below us like a map of all the places we might someday go. Sitting in his truck at that overlook one evening in November, with the heater running and the windows fogged with our breath, he told me about the end of his marriage. "She said I was never really there," he said, staring out at the lights scattered across the valley floor. "Even when I was sitting right next to her, she said I was somewhere else." "Where were you?" I asked, though I thought I might already know the answer. He turned to look at me then, and in the dim light from the dashboard, his face was young again. "Here," he said. "I was always here." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I didn't. We sat in comfortable silence, watching our breath fog the windows, and I thought about all the years I'd spent trying to forget him, all the careful distance I'd maintained, all the boundaries I'd drawn and redrawn around my heart. It was during one of our drives that he told me he'd been thinking about leaving town, starting over somewhere new, somewhere without so much history. The idea of him leaving hit me harder than it should have, harder than I had any right to feel. "Don't," I said, before I could stop myself. He looked surprised. "Why not?" "Because," I started, then stopped. "Because what?" "Because I'd just found him again. Because the thought of him disappearing from my life a second time felt like drowning." "Just don't," I said finally. In early December, he invited me to his house for dinner. "Nothing fancy," he said, "just something simple, like old times." His house was smaller than I'd expected, a ranch-style place on the newer side of town. The divorce had left him with half of everything, which apparently wasn't much. But it was clean and comfortable, and it smelled like the cologne he'd always worn mixed with something that was purely him. He made chili, the kind our mothers used to make when we were kids. We ate at his kitchen table while snow fell outside the windows, and for the first time in months, maybe years, I felt something like contentment. After dinner, he put on music while we cleaned up. Songs from our high school years, the kind of music that carries specific gravity, specific memory. When Black by Pearl Jam came on, he started singing along, badly and unselfconsciously, the way he used to do in his truck when we were 17. I laughed, actually laughed, deep and genuine, in a way I hadn't in longer than I could remember. He stopped singing and looked at me with surprise and something that might have been delight. "There you are," he said softly. The evening stretched longer than either of us had planned. We moved to his living room, sat on opposite ends of his couch, and talked about books and movies and all the small things that fill up a life. It felt natural in a way that nothing had felt natural in years. When I finally looked at my watch, it was past midnight. I stood to leave, gathering my coat and keys with the reluctance of someone who knows the night has been perfect and can't be repeated. He walked me to the door, and as I reached for the handle, he touched my wrist. Not a grab this time, not desperate or urgent, just his fingers against my skin, gentle and questioning. "Julian," he said, and my name in his voice was like a prayer. I pulled away instinctively, some deep-seated reflex that had kept me safe for 20 years. His hand dropped immediately, and he stepped back, the color draining from his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "I shouldn't have." "It's fine," I told him, but we both knew it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. I drove home through empty streets, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. But instead of starting the engine when I reached my driveway, I just sat there, gripping the wheel like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to earth. Something was caving in inside my chest. Some careful structure I'd spent decades building was cracking along its foundation, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to hold it together anymore. The next few days passed in a blur of aggressive normalcy. I graded papers with obsessive thoroughness. I walked longer routes than usual, pushing myself until my legs ached and my lungs burned. I reorganized my bookshelf and cleaned out closets that didn't need cleaning. I did everything I could think of to avoid sitting still, because sitting still meant thinking, and thinking meant remembering the way his fingers had felt against my wrist. I didn't answer when he called. I didn't respond to his texts. I was good at this kind of retreat. I'd had 20 years to perfect it. But late at night, when exhaustion finally claimed me, the memories surfaced anyway. Not just from the evening at his house, but from all the way back. The night before his wedding, standing in that motel parking lot with his fist twisted in my shirt and his eyes full of something I'd been too afraid to name. I remembered the way he'd pulled me close, close enough that I could feel the heat coming off his skin, close enough to count his heartbeats. I remembered how my own heart had hammered against my ribs, how every nerve in my body had screamed at me to close the distance between us, to finally give in to what I'd been feeling since I was 17 years old. And I remembered how he'd let go suddenly, stepped back, and said those words that had haunted me for 2 decades. "You're like a brother to me." I'd smiled then, because smiling was safer than telling the truth. Safer than saying that brothers don't look at each other the way we'd been looking at each other. Safer than admitting that I'd been in love with him since the summer we met, and that love had only grown deeper and more complicated with every year that passed. But my heart had split open anyway, right there in that parking lot, and I'd been trying to hold the pieces together ever since. I avoided him for 6 days. 6 days of letting his calls go to voicemail, of taking different routes to work, of grocery shopping at odd hours when I was unlikely to run into him. 6 days of telling myself I was protecting both of us from a mistake that would change everything. On the 7th day, he found me anyway. I was sitting in the same diner where I'd been waiting for him 3 weeks later, though I didn't know that yet. It was past 11 on a Tuesday night, and I'd been grading essays over coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The place was nearly empty except for me and the waitress, who'd stopped trying to make conversation around 10:30. I heard the bell above the door, but didn't look up. I was deep in a 7th grader's analysis of The Gift of the Magi, trying to decipher handwriting that looked like it had been written during an earthquake, when someone slid into the booth across from me. I knew it was him before I raised my eyes. I'd know the sound of his breathing anywhere, the particular way he settled into a chair, the way he existed in space. When I finally looked up, he was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Patient but determined. Tired but resolute. He didn't ask if he could sit. Didn't apologize for showing up uninvited. Just sat there across from me, his hands folded on the table, waiting. I should have left. Should have gathered my papers and walked out the way I'd walked out of his house 6 days earlier. But something in his face stopped me. Some quality of stillness that suggested he'd been thinking as hard as I had, wrestling with the same impossible questions. "I've been thinking about that night," he said finally, "before the wedding." The words hit me like cold water. I set down my pen carefully, precisely, as if the exact angle might somehow matter. My heart was doing something irregular against my ribs. I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. Because talking about that night meant acknowledging it had happened, and acknowledging it had happened meant facing 20 years of careful denial. The waitress approached with her coffee pot, but Damien waved her away without taking his eyes off me. The gesture was gentle but firm, and she retreated to the counter with the practiced discretion of someone who'd worked late shifts long enough to recognize when a conversation needed privacy. "I didn't mean it," he said, his voice so quiet I had to lean forward to hear him. "What I said, about you being a brother." My hands started trembling then, just slightly, but enough that I had to press them flat against the table to make them stop. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He'd always been able to read me like a book I'd never learned to close. I said it because I didn't know how else to stop myself, he continued, each word careful and deliberate. Because if I hadn't said something, anything, I would have kissed you right there in that parking lot. And I was getting married in the morning. The honesty of it was brutal and beautiful and more than I could bear. I wanted to tell him to stop, to please just stop, because some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. But I also wanted him to keep talking, To finally say all the things we'd spent 20 years dancing around. I've thought about it every day since, he said. What would have happened if I'd been braver? If I'd told you the truth instead of hiding behind that lie? The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of 2 decades. Outside, snow had started falling again, thick flakes that caught the light from the diner's neon sign. Inside, the heater hummed, and the coffee maker gurgled, and my world tilted on its axis. Then he did something I wasn't prepared for. He leaned across the table, slowly, giving me time to pull away, time to stop him, time to do any of the sensible things I should have done. But I didn't move. I just sat there, frozen, as he brought his face close to mine. When he kissed me, it wasn't desperate or urgent the way I'd imagined it might be during all those late nights when I allowed myself to imagine it at all. It was gentle, almost careful, like he was asking a question he wasn't sure he wanted answered. His lips were warm against mine, softer than I'd expected. He tasted like coffee and something I couldn't name, but would remember forever. The kiss lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe 10. Time became elastic, meaningless. When he pulled back, I was still frozen, still sitting there with my hands pressed flat against the table and my heart hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. He searched my face for some sign of what I was feeling, but I'd spent so many years learning to hide that I wasn't sure I remembered how to show. The smart thing would have been to say something. Anything. To acknowledge what had just happened, to talk about what it meant, to figure out together how to navigate this new territory we'd stumbled into. Instead, I stood up. My movements felt mechanical, disconnected from any conscious decision. I reached for my wallet, pulled out a $10 bill, and placed it on the table next to my cold coffee. I gathered my papers with hands that shook only slightly, slipped them into my bag with the same careful precision I used for everything else in my ordered life. Damien watched all of this without speaking. His face had gone carefully blank, the way it used to get in high school, when he was trying not to show he'd been hurt. But I could see it anyway, in the set of his shoulders, in the way his hands had curled into loose fists on the table. "I'm sorry," he said as I turned to leave, and the words followed me all the way to the door. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, covering my windshield in a thin layer of white. I brushed it off with my sleeve, got in my car, and drove home through empty streets that looked like they belonged in someone else's life. I made it exactly 3 blocks before I had to pull over. The tears came without warning, harsh and sudden and completely unlike the careful, controlled grief I'd allowed myself when my mother died. These were different, raw and complicated and shot through with something that felt dangerously close to relief. Because for the first time in my life, someone I loved had told me the truth out loud. I sat there in my car on Elm Street, crying like I hadn't cried since I was 12 years old, and I realized that the terrible, wonderful thing that had been building between us all these weeks wasn't just in my imagination. It was real. It had always been real. He'd been carrying it too, all these years. The weight of what we'd never said, what we'd never allowed ourselves to want. And tonight, in a nearly empty diner with snow falling outside the windows, he'd finally been brave enough to name it. The question now was whether I was brave enough to do the same. When I finally made it home, the house felt different somehow, smaller and larger at the same time. I moved through the familiar rooms like a ghost, touching things that suddenly seemed to belong to someone else. The coffee mug I'd left in the sink that morning, the stack of ungraded papers on my kitchen table, the photograph of my mother and me at my college graduation, both of us squinting into the sun. This was the life I'd built, quiet and safe and carefully controlled. A life where nothing unexpected could touch me, where love was something that happened to other people in movies and books and songs I'd learned not to listen to too closely. But tonight, everything had changed. Tonight, someone had reached across 20 years of silence and touched me with the truth. And I didn't know if I was strong enough to keep pretending it didn't matter. I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the snow falling in my backyard, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself wonder what might happen if I stopped running, if I stopped hiding, if I finally allowed myself to want what I'd been wanting since I was 17 years old. The thought terrified me, but it also, God help me, filled me with something that felt remarkably like hope. I didn't go to work the next day. Called in sick for the first time in 3 years, my voice rough enough over the phone that the secretary didn't question it. I spent the morning sitting at my kitchen table, staring at the stack of ungraded papers I'd abandoned the night before, replaying those 3 seconds in the diner over and over until they felt more like a dream than a memory. The taste of him lingered. The coffee and something sweetness, the warmth of his breath against my face, the way his eyes had looked when he pulled away. Searching, hopeful, terrified. I should have said something. Should have told him that I'd been waiting for that kiss since we were 17, that it was everything I'd imagined and nothing like I'd expected all at once. Should have told him that the reason I'd frozen wasn't because I didn't want it, but because I'd wanted it so desperately for so long that having it finally happen felt like waking up from a 20-year dream. Instead, I'd run. Again. My phone rang 4 times that day. I didn't answer. The 5th time, I unplugged it from the wall and sat in the growing silence of my house, listening to the old radiators tick and hiss, listening to my own breathing, listening to all the words I'd never learned how to say. The snow started falling on Thursday and didn't stop until Sunday. Not the gentle, picturesque kind of snow that makes everything look like a Christmas card, but the heavy, relentless kind that buries the world and makes leaving impossible. I watched it pile up against my windows, drift across my driveway, cover the bare branches of my mother's cherry tree until they looked like they were made of glass. By Friday night, I was completely snowed in. The power flickered twice, but held. The phone lines went down sometime after midnight. For the first time in years, maybe decades, I was entirely cut off from the outside world. I should have felt trapped. Should have felt anxious about the papers I wasn't grading, the lesson plans I wasn't writing, the careful routines that kept my life in order. Instead, I felt something that might have been relief. No one could call. No one could knock on my door. No one could expect anything from me except the bare minimum of survival. I made coffee and toast and sat by the living room window, watching the storm transform my familiar neighborhood into something alien and beautiful. Cars sat buried under white mounds. Street signs disappeared behind curtains of falling snow. Even the sounds were different, muffled, distant, like the world was holding its breath. That's when I remembered the shoebox. It was on the top shelf of my bedroom closet, behind a stack of winter blankets I'd inherited from my mother. I hadn't looked inside it in years, but I knew exactly what it contained. Evidence of a life half-lived. Proof of all the things I'd tried so hard to forget. I pulled it down with hands that trembled only slightly and carried it to the living room. Set it on the coffee table next to my cold mug and stared at it for a long time before I finally lifted the lid. The photographs were on top. Dozens of them, mostly from high school. Damien and me at football games, arms slung around each other's shoulders. Damien and me at graduation, both of us squinting into the June sunlight. Damien and me on that hiking trip the summer before senior year, standing at the edge of a cliff trail with the whole valley spread out below us, both of us grinning like we owned the world. Underneath the photos were ticket stubs. Movies we'd seen together, concerts we'd driven 2 hours to attend. A program from the school play where Damien had somehow convinced me to try out for a small part. My lines were highlighted in yellow. His notes scribbled in the margins. Don't forget to project. You're better than you think you are. At the very bottom, wrapped carefully in tissue paper, was a single dried leaf. Maple, deep red when I'd picked it up, now faded to brown. From the day we'd hiked that cliff trail, the day the photograph had been taken. I'd kept it for reasons I couldn't articulate then and couldn't justify now. Just another piece of evidence that my heart had made its choice long before my mind was willing to acknowledge it. I sat there surrounded by 20 years of carefully preserved memories, and I finally understood what I'd been doing all this time. I hadn't been protecting myself from getting hurt. I'd been protecting myself from having to choose between the life I'd built and the life I'd always wanted. But sitting alone in my storm-locked house, holding that faded leaf in my palm, I realized that choosing nothing was still a choice. And it was the wrong one. I tried to write him a letter. Started it 6 different ways, filled up 4 pages with words that never said what I meant. How do you apologize for 20 years of cowardice? How do you explain that you've been in love with someone since you were 17, but were too afraid to admit it even to yourself? In the end, I threw it all away. Some things can't be written. Some truths can only be spoken aloud, in person, with all the terrifying vulnerability that requires. The snow stopped Sunday night. By Monday morning, the plows had cleared the main roads. I spent the day digging out my driveway, my car, the path to my front door. Physical work that felt like preparation for something I couldn't quite name. Tuesday, I went back to school. My students asked where I'd been, and I told them I'd been snowed in. They accepted this without question, the way children accept most explanations from adults. I taught my classes, graded papers, attended a faculty meeting about standardized test scores. I moved through the familiar routines of my life as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The storm had broken something loose inside me, some dam I'd built to hold back 20 years of wanting. And now that it was broken, I couldn't rebuild it. Didn't want to rebuild it. That night, I found myself driving through the quiet streets of our small town. Not toward anywhere in particular, just driving, trying to work up the courage for what I knew I had to do. I drove past the high school, past the diner where he'd kissed me, past all the places that held pieces of our shared history. Finally, I turned onto his street. His house was dark except for one light in the front window. His truck sat in the driveway, half buried under snow he hadn't bothered to clear. I parked at the curb and sat there for a long time, engine running, windshield wipers pushing away the light snow that had started falling again. I could leave, could put the car in drive and go home to my quiet house and my ordered life and pretend that none of this had happened. Could spend the next 20 years the way I'd spent the last 20, careful and safe and slowly dying inside. Or I could get out of the car. When I finally knocked on his door, I was soaked through. The snow had turned to sleet, and my coat was no match for it. I stood there shivering, trying to think of what I would say when he opened the door, how I would begin to explain. But when he appeared in the doorway, backlit by the warm light from his living room, the words came simply. "You lied," I said. "So did I?" All my life. He didn't ask what I meant. Didn't ask why I was standing on his doorstep at 10 o'clock at night, dripping melted ice onto his welcome mat. He just stepped aside and let me in. His living room was exactly as I remembered it from that dinner in December. The same couch, the same coffee table, the same sense of quiet comfort. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like sanctuary. We sat together without speaking, no music playing, no wine to soften the edges of what needed to be said. Just the two of us and 20 years of silence to break through. The heater hummed in the corner, filling the space with warm air that smelled like him. "I've carried it since I was 17, I said finally. Maybe longer. The love, the shame, the wanting something I thought I could never have. I built my whole life around not having it, around pretending it didn't matter. But it did matter. It was the only thing that ever mattered." He listened without interrupting, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes never leaving my face. When I was finished, when I'd finally said all the things I'd been too afraid to say for 20 years, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've been waiting for this conversation since I was 19. We didn't kiss again that night. Didn't rush toward anything physical or dramatic. We just sat there on his couch, our shoulders barely touching, like two boys who'd finally grown too old to be afraid of what they felt." Outside, the sleet continued to fall, tapping against the windows like fingers asking to be let in. Inside, we sat in the kind of silence that feels like coming home. Spring came early that year, the way it sometimes does when winter has been particularly harsh. By March, the snow had melted completely, leaving behind the kind of muddy, expectant earth that promises everything and delivers quietly. I was staying late in my classroom, the way I always did on Thursdays, wiping down the whiteboard with careful, deliberate strokes. Room 204 was empty except for me and the afternoon light slanting through windows that needed washing. My students had left an hour ago, chattering about weekend plans and spring break trips to places I'd never been. The day's lessons still ghosted across the board in faint chalk lines. We'd been discussing metaphor again, the way poets use ordinary things to mean extraordinary things. how a road can be a life, how a season can be a chance to begin again. I erased it all with the same steady motions I'd used for 14 years. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new possibilities for understanding. But tonight, there was just the quiet satisfaction of work completed, of another day navigated successfully. The drive home took me through the center of town, past the diner where everything had changed and changed again, past the high school where we'd walked those empty hallways and remembered being young together, past all the landmarks of a life I'd thought was finished but was really just beginning. My house looked different now, though the changes were subtle. 2 cars in the driveway instead of 1. A pair of work boots beside the front door that weren't mine. Small signs that solitude was no longer the defining characteristic of my existence. Inside, the changes were more obvious. 2 coffee mugs sat on the kitchen table, though only one showed signs of recent use. A book of poetry lay open beside them, something by Mary Oliver that I'd been reading in the mornings before school. The margins were filled with pencil marks, thoughts scribbled in handwriting that was becoming as familiar as my own. In the living room, a dog slept curled on the rug near the window. A golden retriever mix that Damien had rescued from the shelter 2 weeks after we'd had our conversation about wanting to share something besides memories. Scout, he'd named him, though I'd lobbied unsuccessfully for something more literary. The animal had taken to our quiet routines with the adaptability of creatures who understand love when they find it. He slept through my morning coffee, followed Damien around the garden in the afternoons, and positioned himself strategically between us on the couch during the evenings when we read or watched old movies or simply sat in the kind of comfortable silence that comes after years of having too much to say. I was reading when I heard Damien's truck in the driveway, the familiar sound of the engine that needed work he kept promising to get done. Scout lifted his head, ears perked, then settled back into sleep when he realized it was only his other human coming home. The front door opened quietly. Damien had learned the particular way sound carried in my house, had adapted his movements to accommodate my need for gentle transitions. He appeared in the kitchen doorway carrying grocery bags, his hair damp from what looked like recent rain. Our eyes met across the small space, and he smiled the way he'd been smiling at me since that night in February when we'd finally stopped pretending we were anything other than what we'd always been. It was a quiet smile, full of recognition and contentment, and the kind of love that doesn't need to announce itself. Nothing was said. Nothing needed to be said. This was what we'd learned in the months since we'd stopped running from each other. That love could be simple once you stopped making it complicated. That happiness could be quiet once you stopped expecting it to be loud. He unpacked groceries while I finished the chapter I'd been reading. Scout wandered into the kitchen, hoping for dropped treats or attention, receiving both in equal measure. Outside, the evening settled into the soft gray that comes before full darkness, and I felt that familiar sense of rightness that had become as natural as breathing. Later, we sat on the back porch with glasses of wine, watching the garden that had been my mother's and was now somehow ours. The tulips had come early, just as the weather forecast had promised, red and yellow and white, pushing up through soil that still held the memory of winter. Damien had helped me plant them last fall, his hands working beside mine in the earth, both of us pretending we weren't thinking about permanence, about seasons we might spend together, about roots that go deeper than flowers. Now, seeing them bloom in the gathering dusk, I understood that we'd been planting more than bulbs. We'd been planting the possibility of a future neither of us had been brave enough to imagine alone. When we went inside, I found myself at the kitchen window, looking out at the garden we'd tended together. On the windowsill, where my mother used to keep her reading glasses, 2 brass keys lay side by side. Identical copies of the same lock, made the week after Damien had asked if I thought it might be time to stop maintaining 2 houses when we only ever wanted to be in one. I picked up one of the keys, feeling its weight in my palm. The metal was warm from the day's sun, and as I set it back down, it caught the last light from outside and threw it back in a small, bright arc. Some things take 20 years to understand. Some doors take decades of walking past before you finally find the courage to try the key. But when you do, When you finally stop being afraid of what you might find on the other side, the light that waits there is worth every year of darkness you've walked through to reach it. Outside, the tulips nodded in the evening breeze, and I thought about metaphors again. How a flower can be a promise. How a season can be forgiveness. How a key can be the beginning of everything you never knew you were looking for.